The Reverend Luke Harris, at 99 years old, had never felt so alone in his life as he did on the night of his wife's death. Snow fell that December 21, unusual for the hill country of Texas. From the picture window of the living room where she lay, he saw that snow covered the ground. It's Texas, so not so much a blanket, but as a threadbare sheet. He felt alone, but he was not by himself. He was surrounded by more family than he could possibly have imagined in 1967 when Luke and Sarah received word that their son, their only child, had been killed in action. His whole family had gathered the week before Christmas, packed into the old house where he and Sarah had lived for more than 50 years. The pandemic had kept the extended family apart for 3 years, and now, as if to make up time, they all descended on their hometown, some staying in the old home, and some bunking with friends, and some staying in a hotel in Austin. They all came knowing that it would be Sarah's last Christmas. But their matriarch drew her final breath a few days before Christmas. Luke's first call was to their new pastor, Kate, and she arrived before the funeral home staff. Kate had heard their story, that Sarah and Luke did not even know they were grandparents until these children arrived from Vietnam as refugees at 10 years old with a mother who was in her last weeks of life. And Kate had been with Luke and Sarah a few days before when Sarah was still conscious, trying to put all of her long-term memories into order and having one of her final lucid conversations with her husband, Luke. The house had buzzed with the energy of a family reunion. And Sarah asked Luke, "How many great-grandchildren do we have now?" "To tell the truth," Luke whispered, "I lost count at 12. And I think there are more. And I'm pretty sure there's another one on the way." "Oh my," she said, "how did that happen from only Ben and Han?" "They started having children young," he said, "and twins run in the family." "Twins?" Sarah asked, "or litters?" Luke squeezed her hand. "I suspect there may be a set of triplets," he said, "but I can't remember for sure." "From a remnant, a nation rises," she said. "Or at least 2 basketball teams. And some spares on the bench," Luke said. It was early in the morning of December 21st, still dark, when Kate arrived, a few minutes after Sarah had died. Everyone else in the house still slept when Kate and Luke sat next to Sarah's body. "At 99, no one expects much of anything from me anymore," Luke said to Kate, "though I'm not complaining. I don't expect much of myself either. I'm just surprised to wake up alive every morning. Ben, Han, and all these children put up the Christmas tree. Must be nearly 20 years since I've preached a sermon. Not that I'm looking for an invitation, but I am thinking I want to speak at the service for Sarah. Just a small graveside service for family." He seemed to have forgotten that no service that included his whole family would be small. Pastor Kate said, "We can wait till after Christmas if you want. There's no need to hurry." But to Luke, there was reason to hurry. "It's a busy time of year for you, I know," he said, "but all I need from you is just be present. I'll plan the service with my grandchildren. I wouldn't ask you to do another service on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, but the time between death and burial feels to me like that full beat of silence at the end of Handel's Messiah. It has to be there, but it has to resolve. I need to hear that alleluia, that final alleluia after the silence before I can move forward." And so the family gathered in the cemetery behind the church on a gray Christmas Eve afternoon, the final patches of snow melting into the ground. Han's oldest child, Elizabeth, sang a cappella, "I wonder as I wander out under the sky, that Jesus, my Savior, did come for to die, for poor ornery people like you and like I. I wonder as I wander out under the sky." In the reverent silence after the final note of the spiritual, a light snow began to fall, and the family and friends, more of their friends than they had anticipated, squeezed in close to get under the tent. At Luke's nod, the funeral director lowered the casket into the grave, and Luke stood at the edge of the grave, cleared his throat, silently commanded his tears to recede, and he began to speak. "Thank you for coming," he said, "for honoring your grandmother, your great-grandmother, your friend on such a holy day." It seems a contradiction while the world is rocking around the Christmas tree, while our children are about to burst with anticipation for the joy of Christmas, that we would be here proclaiming an Easter message. But there is no Easter without Christmas. If Jesus had not arrived as God in human flesh, if the angels had not sung to the shepherds of Emmanuel, God with us, then his death would have been permanent. Our death would be permanent. There can be no resurrection without incarnation. I've never in my life felt so fully, truly, utterly alone. I love you all, and I'm glad we're together in our grief. But I am nevertheless alone in my particular grief, for nobody knew Sarah as I did. Nobody loved Sarah as I did. Well, nobody but Jesus. And that, I believe, is the point of incarnation, that none of us is ever truly as alone as we feel in a moment such as this. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Isaiah assures us, those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. That's the good news of God in human flesh. What I'll try to remember when I cannot see the light, that again and again, when this world is in deep darkness, God has come into the world, even as a baby. Luke smiled a bit as he said the word baby and made eye contact with his great-granddaughter Elizabeth, who stood with her arm draped across her belly. Her mouth dropped open at the realization that he knew from the sheer wisdom of his 99 years what she had not yet spoken aloud to anyone. He continued, reciting the liturgy of committal he'd uttered hundreds of times over the graves of friends and parishioners. For if we have been united with Christ in a death like his, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. Luke reached down and scooped up a handful of the earth piled next to the grave, and as he stood, he felt the soft earth beneath him ever so slightly begin to shift. He didn't feel afraid, just puzzled that the ground would move. What happened next will be told for generations in many different ways. To some, it will be told as a story of the most shocking thing they ever witnessed at a funeral. To others, such as Luke's great-grandson Gabriel, who will follow in Luke's footsteps as a storytelling preacher, it will be a sermon illustration. Those who stood at the back of the crowd saw Luke standing there, and then he was not. It looked to them as if he had disappeared into thin air. Luke was surprised to find himself in the grave, sitting on the casket. A layer of muddy sod cushioned his fall. He sat there, eyebrows raised in surprise, as the funeral director scrambled for purchase and tried to pull Luke out of the mud as if he might get him out quickly enough that nobody would notice. The family's collective gasp was followed by a beat of silence and then a lone voice coming from the grave. Was it the keening of grief? A sob? A moan of pain? No, the sound coming from the grave was laughter. Luke sat in the mud and the wet grass, his freshly dry-cleaned suit now a muddy mess, and he laughed. He wiped the tears from his eyes and left a streak of mud on each side of his face. Those on terra firma above him shifted uncomfortably, not sure if the laughter was mirth or madness, not sure if his tears were from laughter or grief. He was not sure either. Once Luke was hauled out of the grave and everyone could see that he was not hurt, Pastor Kate pronounced a benediction and they all went back to the house. They ate from the spread that was doubled by comfort and joy. Comfort from the contributions of friends and neighbors who brought condolence casseroles, and joy from the usual holiday fare. The family spent the evening telling stories of solemn moments interrupted by surprises and breaking into laughter when they remembered that afternoon. And that night, Pastor Kate preached a Christmas Eve sermon that acknowledged the darkness of this world, from the wars in Ukraine, South Sudan, Israel and Gaza, to the loss of loved ones and the uncertainty of our times. And into this darkness, she brought the good news of Christmas, that the birth of Jesus is the light that shines in darkness. When Pastor Kate stood at the communion table and pronounced the invitation, she looked up and saw Luke a few rows back from the front, stifling a laugh as he remembered his afternoon mishap. "This is the joyful feast of the people of God," she recited, and when she looked at Luke, she had to stop and press her lips together to stifle her own laugh, lest she appear too joyful. But the restraint was short-lived. Once the elements were distributed and Luke held the communion bread in his hand, he looked at it and he saw a faint remnant of dried mud beneath his fingernails, earth from the grave he had clawed his way out of. And a smile crossed his face, then a suppressed guffaw. Then, when he looked at the mischievous face of the teenage great-grandson who sat next to him, they both broke into a laugh that spread down the row of his family members and then throughout the sanctuary, for word had traveled fast of Luke's journey in and out of Sarah's grave that afternoon. So nobody had any doubt about what it was that was so funny. Luke and his family left the sanctuary that night, released from the tension of death, and turned loose on the road of grieving. They held grief and joy at once that dark night, as light holds its essence in particle and wave. Before the Lenten journey is complete, Luke will join Sarah, taking his place in the grave next to her, this time never to climb out until the last day. In his funeral instructions, he asks that all be invited to partake in communion, those who believe and those who do not or cannot. He says the world is so full of mystery. If understanding the mystery of God entering the world in human flesh were to be a prerequisite for joining in communion, none of us would dare approach the table. If our own faith rather than the faith of Christ is what qualified us, who could partake? That's the point, isn't it? That we fall short of understanding. We fall short of faith. And God sent Jesus Christ into the world to bridge the chasm between us and God, that deep mystery that meets us where we are in this simple meal of bread and wine. And so the family, friends, and church will gather, giving thanks for life, for one another, and for the unfathomable mystery that binds us together through all time and space. Thanks be to God.